Hello and welcome to my talk on flimsy feminism. I hope there are men listening as well as women, because that's part of what I'm talking about. What do I mean by flimsy feminism? What I mean is that a lot of us, almost all of us, I hope, now believe that women are in every respect equal to men, that they are just as competent, just as intelligent, just as expert as men. But do we actually put those beliefs into practice in our everyday interactions with women? Even something as trivial as you see a man and a woman standing together and you go up to talk to them and you just automatically address the man first. Now that's a very small example, but I'm going to talk about the ways in which we don't really practice what we preach or what we believe when it comes to feminism. Here's a classic example of it, which I think a lot of women will recognize. Doesn't that happen so often? You're an expert in something, you talk to a man about it, and he tells you what is actually the case. Okay, it's often known as mansplaining. Now, I call this the authority gap. We all know about the gender pay gap and all sorts of other gaps between men and women, but this is possibly the mother of all gaps, the authority gap. And it's the implicit assumption that a man knows what he's talking about until he proves otherwise, while so often for women, it's the other way around. So to find my terms, authority, what do? I immediately look at the Oxford Online Dictionary and I do a screenshot for you, and it tells us that authority is about having power over other people and also being an authority on a subject, in other words, having expertise. But what killed me when I looked at this, and it wasn't what I was looking for in the first place, was that every single example they give begins with the pronoun he. So we have he had absolute authority over his subordinates. He has the natural authority of one who is used to being obeyed. He hit the ball with authority, and he was an authority on the stock market. I mean, as if Margaret Thatcher didn't have the natural authority of one who is used to being obeyed, or Serena Williams doesn't hit the ball with authority, or Helena Morrissey isn't an expert on authority on the stock market. I mean, sometimes your subject just comes up and slaps you in the face. How we associate men with authority, and how we are much more uncomfortable associating women with authority. And that is a very important example of the flimsy feminism I'm trying to illustrate here. So in the course of researching the book that I'm writing, which is going to be called The Authority Gap, I have interviewed about 50 women who are right at the very, very top of their game. So the most authoritative women I could come across. And you might ask yourself, well, why is she talking to them? What have they got to teach us about this lack of respect for women's authority? And my thinking was, if even they have experienced the authority gap, if they have experienced these phenomena of not being respected as much, not being listened to as much, being ignored, being interrupted, being talked over, then surely that proves that it's true for the rest of womankind. So here's an example. Frances Morris, she is one of the most powerful, not just women in the art world, but people in the art world globally. She's director of Tate Modern. And she said to me, as director of Tate Modern, I can spend all day as a powerful, articulate person who's taken seriously. And I can leave this building and I'm nobody. Because as a woman in the world out there, I'm not taken seriously. I'm very often in situations where people who don't know my job, and my hand is shaken after the hand of a male colleague, my eyes are met after the eyes of my husband are met, and no interest is shown in my opinion if it's just my opinion as a late middle-aged female. And I see all that because it's in stark contrast with the way I'm approached and treated when it's known that I'm the director of Tate Modern. So, of course, I said to her, well, maybe that happens to male directors of Tate Modern too, if people don't know what their job is. Oh, no, she said, I've worked for 3 male directors of Tate Modern, and it hasn't happened to them. I think that's a fantastic example of the authority gap. Now, I'm sure a lot of women have had this experience. You're at a meeting, you come up with a suggestion, nobody takes a blind bit of notice until a man makes exactly the same suggestion and everyone says, brilliant idea. Shubi Rao, I talked to, she's former treasurer of Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google. Big job, right? And she said, you have to constantly prove yourself over and over again. When a guy says something at a meeting, the others will say, yeah, that sounds great, I think we should do it. Then a woman says something, they'll say, oh, well, I think we should look into it. I think we need more data. I think we need to think about that. I don't know if it's really going to work. She says, I get challenged a lot, constantly, and it's become a way of life. Now, one form that the authority gap takes is being interrupted. So you are an authority on a subject, and somebody, usually a man, I'm afraid to say, and this isn't prejudice, this is fact, simply interrupts you and talks over you. Now that is it's incredibly undermining of your authority. First of all, it suggests that he thinks what he's got to say is much more interesting than what you've got to say. And secondly, it is literally silencing you if he's talking over you. So here was a study done by some social psychologists, and they looked at 31 conversations, a third between two men, a third between two women, and a third between a man and a woman. And in the first two put together, there were only 7 interruptions. In the third one, the mixed sex group, there were 48, 46 of them by a man. Now, I mean, this is obviously incredibly striking, but it is quite an old study. It's several decades old. So I thought, I wonder if that's still the case. So I then found a study done only a few years ago of 10,000 hours of transcripts of oral proceedings in the US Supreme Court. You don't get more authoritative than being a US Supreme Court justice, right? Here's the fabulous Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It turns out that women make up only a third of the justices, but have to suffer 2/3 of all interruptions. So in other words, they are 4 times more likely to be interrupted than the men on the Supreme Court, and 96% of those interruptions were by men. Now, another interesting facet of this is talking time. Now, the urban myth is, oh, women talk much more than men do. Actually, it's not true. If you mic somebody up for the day and you measure men and women, how many words they say in the course of the day, it's pretty much the same. But it is certainly true that in public, when it comes to sort of expatiating, men tend to bang on for longer than women. I often call it conversational manspreading. There was a lovely example here where researchers gave groups of men and women a cassette to talk into, so yes, slightly old-fashioned, and 3 paintings of Dürer to look at. And then they were asked to talk for as long as they liked about what they saw and liked or disliked about these paintings. On average, women talked for 3.17 minutes. Men talked on average for 4 times as long, 13 minutes. But even that wasn't accurate because 3 of the men were still talking when their cassette tapes, the 30-minute cassette tapes, ran out. But I think possibly a more interesting study was done where the researchers put men and women into small groups of, I think, 8 people in each group, and they were asked to come up with a solution to a sort of town hall problem about whether to raise taxes to spend more money on local services. And they found that in almost every mixture of men and women, so they had groups that were all men, 1 woman, 2 women, 3 women, 4 women, all women. In almost every group, the women talked disproportionately less than the men, and for a disproportionate amount of time. So if they made up 1/5 of the group, they talked for less than 1/5 of the time, except for in 2 circumstances. One was if women made up at least 80% of the group, and then women talked for a proportionate amount of time. But interestingly, the second reason was when the rules of decision-making were changed, so that instead of having to have a majority agreeing on the solution, it had to be everybody. It was unanimity, so it was like a jury trial. And in those cases, women spoke up. Now, what that suggests is that they only spoke up when they knew their views had to be listened to, because everyone had to agree on the end solution. And they knew that otherwise, what was the point, frankly? Now, were they right to be suspicious of whether their views would be taken into account? I'm very sorry to say that they were, because here's a very interesting study on influence. Bear with me because it's a little bit complicated, but anyway, 143 business studies students, roughly half and half male and female. They were given a video to watch and some information to read about what to do in the case of a bushfire. And then they were asked to rank in order of importance which objects they should take with them if they were to make them more likely to survive a bushfire. And it might have been a torch or a blanket or whatever. Now, there is an official ranking of order of importance for these items, and so their answers were measured against the official ranking to see how well they did and how many of these they sort of got right. It turned out women were just as good at men at doing this task, and they were actually just as confident of their ability as men. And then the researchers put them into groups. And in each group, they put 1 very high-scoring person who they deemed to be an expert. Now, the group didn't know who that expert was, and the expert didn't know who they were. What was the result? Women exerted less influence within their groups than men. So in other words, if you compared the women's initial ranking with the ranking the group finally coalesced on, there was more disparity between the women's and the men's. Female experts were perceived as less expert than female non-experts. and they exerted significantly less influence than the non-experts, which sounds really weird, doesn't it? But I'll explain why. Whereas the male experts were significantly more influential than the male non-experts.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.